Welcome, all of you, to this second session of the workshop, Social Cultural Context of Violence. And let me briefly welcome our speakers, Ambassador Lino Gutierrez from Gutierrez Global LLC, Barthélemy Bazemo from the African Faith and Justice Network, and Andrés Villaveses from the World Bank. I am Arturo Cervantes, and I have the pleasure of moderating this panel today. Now, we all know that violence is costly, complex, and preventable. So our charge to our panelists today would be to please help us in responding some of the following questions. What are the drivers or factors for social, cultural, and political that encourage lethal violence? What are the lethal means for self-directed, interpersonal, or collective violence? How may we improve research, prevention, interventions, and implementation of interventions? And what are some of the program and policy gaps in knowledge that we might tackle? And most importantly, maybe to suggest the concrete action, present or future, for improved prevention and multi-sector collaboration. Let me share briefly as an introduction my own viewpoint, coming from a Latin American country, Mexico, and I will speak on behalf of Mexican viewpoint and a Central American viewpoint. And I think this is very relevant given that in terms of the global regions, Latin America and the Caribbean and Central America have the highest homicide rates. We have become, over the last few years, the most violent region in the planet. And you might recall the recent happenings in Mexico, in Ayotzinapa, where 43 college students have been sequestered and murdered by government, security forces, and state authorities. As Fran Henry was saying yesterday, she has hope for the human connection, and so do I, faith in humanity. And also Shelley was sharing with us his faith in this group gathered here today, who has mustered the will to change how things currently are. After all, I believe that we all share the core values of the founding fathers of this great country, the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of justice. So let me tell you how costly and what means for violence in your next door neighbor to the south as an example. Mexico, with a population of 120 million students, 120 million persons, of which 24 million are students and 2 million are teachers, is suffering a grave epidemic. Some of the data that I will share with you now come from the last 15 years of gathering information on violent deaths and lethal means. Let me share with you that from 1998 to 2012, we've had more than 220,000 homicides and more than 70,000 suicides. Of these, 67% and 77% have been with firearms, respectively, for homicides and suicides. And what's alarming is that over the last 15 years, the growth of the use of firearms for committing a lethal homicide or a suicide has risen 18% for homicides and 26% for suicides. And what's also striking is that these figures have risen especially for women. 36% growth in firearm homicide for females and 72% growth in suicide with firearms also for women. Aside these striking figures that are affecting the younger age groups, specifically males and young children, we have seen more than 50,000 people disappear over the last decade. Disappear. Nobody knows where they are, like those 43 Ayotzinapa students. Of those 220,000 murders, 16,000 murders can be attributed directly to drug trafficking organizations. The Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluations has estimated that every year Mexico loses, on average, 1.5 million disability-adjusted life years from our population. And the World Bank has estimated that this epidemic is costing us between 8 and 15% of our GDP. Further studies, like the Institute for Peace Studies out of Geneva, estimate that if you count the indirect and intangible costs of violence, this figure could rise to 27% of our GDP. The latest victimization survey carried out this year shows us that 34% of our homes have been victimized by crime and delinquency. This is more than 11 million homes victimized. And that 28% of all the population older than 18 years has been victimized. This is more than 23 million people. And that out of the 33 million crimes that have occurred last year, of which 18 million have had the victim close to his attacker or to the delinquent, 50% are carried out with firearms. This means more than 9 million incidents of violence and delinquency in your southern neighbor have occurred with firearm use. Strikingly, firearms are illegal to manufacture or to import to our country. The University of California at Berkeley and the Igarape Institute, in a 2013 paper called The Way of the Gun, estimate that 47% of US firearm dealers depend on Mexico's illegal gun trade for their survival. The Mexican government will seize yearly approximately 30,000 firearms, which are less than 15% of all the illegal new firearms that are thought to be brought into the country. The University of San Diego has recently estimated that the sale of firearms to Mexico has grown significantly from the decade of the 90s to the year 2012, passing from less than 100,000 guns entering illegally our country to an estimate high number of 430,000 guns illegally entering the country every year. What about the 300 or more used guns that exist in this country? How many of those have entered Mexico and Central America? The United States Government Accountability Office has estimated that 70% of Mexican guns recovered in crime scenes are US traced. This figure varies from a low 20 to a high 90%, but definitely our students can't learn in this environment, our children can't grow, and our families can't thrive with what is going on. Let me share some of the complex facts around this figure. It is a given that the increase in guns, ammunition, and firearms coming from the United States and that are in circulation in Mexico and in Central America is directly related to the increase in murders, in suicide, in delinquency, and in high-impact crime. The drug trafficking organizations are thriving with this because of the climate of fear, because of the intimidation that they want to create, and because this way they accumulate power. And this is a cycle that generates a lot of migration towards the United States. Data from the Firearms Transfer Database obtained this year shows us that the suppliers of conventional weapons and firearms for 80% globally are led by the United States with 31%, followed by Russia, Germany, France, and the United Kingdom. Means matter. Means matter, and they determine outcomes. In 2013 book by John Dodson, a former ATF agent who became informant for the Congress, his book is called The Unarmed Truth. And he talks about the US tragically inept policies. And he talks about a circle of idiocy where the DEA is cultivating informants, the ATF is encouraging trafficking, the FBI is financing purchases of guns that are directly transferred to drug trafficking organizations in Mexico and in Central America. The University of San Diego Igarape study that I just mentioned concludes that the ongoing government efforts to regulate firearms, trade, and trafficking across the US-Mexico border are largely ineffective. Seizing weapons by authorities is meager in relation to the overall volume of weapons crossing the border. And as Daniel Webster was sharing with us yesterday, United States policies have been privileging profits from firearm sales over public health or well-being of your neighboring countries. How is this preventable? Mexico and Central America, we all have laws that prohibit the sale and manufacture of firearms. However, our national governments and our public security institutions are ineffective in stopping the flow. US, Mexican, and Central American governments are facing this menacing threat, a threat that is growing because of access to firearms by drug trafficking organizations and citizens. This has enormous public health impacts. I would argue that there is a willful neglect by the United States of your southern neighbors, despite the tremendous impact that the region's chronic crime, poverty, and instability has on North America, starting with illegal immigration. The lax US gun laws, the inept policies and programs, the economics and politics that benefit a few are affecting the many. The rise in illicit US-made or originated weapons breeds the upward trend in homicide, in suicide, and in criminal organized crime. Violence, as we all know, spreads infectiously, and the main means for violence in Mexico and Central America are weapons produced or originated commercially from this country. On December 10th, a few days ago, US State Secretary John Kerry said, and I quote, "The United States stands next to Mexico's President Enrique Peña Nieto to promote critical security and justice efforts." I close quote. At the outset of the 21st century, we must move beyond political rhetoric to action. Having said this, what are the actions that I would propose? Being here today in this room, at the Institute of Medicine, at the National Academies, in this beautiful Keck Center, is humbling. I am awestruck, for example, by the Keck telescope that peers outside of our galaxy, 26,000 light years away to the origins of the Big Bang and the universe. Our common humanity is emphasized. All countries are part of one Earth. All humans are part of one humanity. Especially OCDE, well-developed nations must share responsibility for this violence epidemic. We must stop the means from flowing to affected countries. The scale of trade demonstrates that the United States is an important contributor to the global supply of firearms in illicit markets. These are the main means for the violence that we are living every day. All suppliers of lethal means would need to be required and have an ethical and moral mandate for greater initiative, for stricter measures, for willful international collaboration, for decisive action on gun control. The United States specifically in their domestic firearms regulations. And I ask you, if these more than 300,000 deaths were from Ebola or from a new strain of influenza, would not the United States be really helping and contributing to stop the spread of such disease? As Shelley quoted yesterday, the desire to end violence and fear of harm due to violence is shared across peoples from all cultures, nations, ethnicities, age groups, religions, and races. There is a concomitant responsibility for US authorities in this grave regional crisis. And I will end with this quote from Albert Einstein, who he said, and it's written in the wall as you enter this beautiful building, "The right to search for truth implies also a duty. One must not conceal any part of what one has recognized to be true." And I ask you here at the Global Violence Prevention Forum, in our silence, are we not holding ourselves to the highest standards of scientific evidence? Thank you. And with this, I will introduce I hope you like the globe. And please, it is my pleasure to introduce Ambassador Lino Gutierrez, who will talk about a diplomatic view for global violence prevention.